Today's mindful moment, packed with insights but designed to fit into your busy life. One deep dive at a time. Ever feel like, the things we think of as progress are like built on something darker? Like maybe the line between wisdom and cruelty is, thinner than we like to admit.
It's a disturbing thought, isn't it?
It really is. That's exactly what we're looking at today. You suggested Tom Holland's Dominion, the Christian Revolution remade the world, and wow, it's quite a journey. We're talking philosophy, religion, politics, everything really.
Holland's making a big argument. He says that Christianity in many ways shaped the very foundation of Western civilization, even parts we think of as totally secular today.
Yeah, so our goal today is to see if he's right. Did Christianity really have that much influence?
I think to even start with Holland's argument, you have to start with how he describes the ancient world,
Okay.
specifically the Roman Empire.
Right, makes sense.
And the thing is, Holland doesn't shy away from how brutal that time was. He describes punishments that would be just unthinkable today. Crucifixions, people burned alive, left to die in the arena.
It's hard to imagine that kind of casual cruelty.
It really is.
So then how did Christianity coming out of that world become both its inheritor and its transformer?
That's the paradox. Christianity absorbed elements of Roman culture, things like philosophy, law, and art. But then, as Holland puts it, it twisted them into something completely new.
Okay, so how did that actually happen? Can you give us example of this twisting?
Sure, let's take the concept of martyrdom. For Romans, dying for your beliefs was seen as foolish weakness. But the early Christians, well, they turned that on its head. They saw suffering and sacrifice in the name of their faith as a source of power, even glory. It was a total departure from how everyone else saw things.
Wow, so they embraced death instead of fearing it. That's a powerful statement.
It is, and that shift had huge consequences. Think about it. If you're willing to die for what you believe in, well, how much more are you willing to stand up for it? To resist injustice, even if it means going against those in power. Martyrdom, in a sense, became a weapon against the very people trying to destroy them.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. It makes the spread of Christianity, despite being persecuted, make more sense.
Exactly. And that leads to another key part of Holland's argument, that belief is central to Christianity. He's saying that this focus on what someone personally believes, on an inner conviction that shapes your actions, was a radical change from Roman religion. Roman religion was mostly about rituals, about doing things to please the gods. But Christianity made what you believed the most important part of who you were.
So it's like Christianity made faith an internal thing in a way that hadn't been done before.
That's a great way to put it. And that internalization had consequences. It led to this almost obsession with defining correct belief with getting rid of heresy. Suddenly what you thought, what you believed deep down became something to be controlled, argued about, even fought over.
It's like that's still happening today. Debates about free speech, cancel culture, this idea that there's only one right way to think, makes you wonder if we've really moved on from those anxieties from back in Roman times.
That's a question Holland seems to be asking throughout the book. He's saying that maybe these worries, these struggles over what we believe and who we are just built into Western thought.
So even when we think we've left religion behind, we're still wrestling with its ghosts.
Maybe, but it goes deeper than that. Holland argues that even things like human rights, social justice, even the very idea of progress are all rooted in Christian history.
That's a pretty bold statement. I mean, we usually think of those as secular values, like they come from the Enlightenment, not religious beliefs.
That's the challenge Holland is throwing at us. He's asking us to rethink where these ideas came from, to trace them back to their beginnings.
I'm curious how he makes that connection. Can you give an example? What's the link between, say, human rights and Christianity?
Think about universal human dignity, the idea that all people have inherent value. Holland traces that back to the belief that everyone is made in the image of God.
So even if we take out the explicitly religious part, that core idea is still there.
That's exactly what Holland's saying. He suggests that those values we see as secular are built on foundations laid by Christian thought.
It's fascinating, but I'm still trying to wrap my head around it. Can you give us some actual examples from history? How does Holland show this happening?
Well, he talks about figures like Martin of Tours. He was a Roman soldier who famously split his cloak with a beggar. This act of compassion became a big symbol of Christian charity, of caring for those in need.
It's a great story.
Yeah.
And it makes you think, have you ever felt that pull between wanting to help others and focusing on your own success. It's like these old moral questions are still with us today.
Absolutely. Holland's suggesting that those stories, those acts of compassion rooted in Christianity, weren't just one-offs. They helped shape a whole way of seeing the world, a way of understanding what we owe to others. And he argues that worldview is still influencing us, whether we realize it or not.
Like a hidden code running under our moral compass.
Right. And it's not just charity. Holland makes even more unexpected connections. He argues that even the scientific revolution, which we often see as going against religion, was actually shaped by a Christian understanding of the universe.
Wait, I thought science and religion were supposed to be opposites.
That's what we usually hear, but Holland makes it more complicated. He says the Christian idea of a universe with laws, a universe created by a rational God, actually set the stage for scientific thinking.
So instead of faith and reason being enemies, they were connected.
Exactly. It's another example of how Holland challenges our assumptions about history. He pushes us to see the connections, the complexities that we often miss.
It's definitely making me think about things in a new way. But let's be honest, it's not all good, right? Christianity has a dark side: persecution, violence, oppression.
Holland doesn't ignore that. He talks about the Crusades, the Inquisition, the times when Christian beliefs were used to justify cruelty and intolerance.
It's hard to square those things with the message of love and compassion at the heart of Christianity.
It's a tension that's been there throughout the whole history of Christianity. And Holland doesn't pretend to have easy answers. He just shows us the evidence and makes us face the difficult truths, the messiness that's part of the story.
So then, where do we go from here? If Holland's right, are we just playing out the latest chapter of a story that started thousands of years ago? Are we still, in some way, living in the shadow of the cross?
That's the question Holland leaves us with.
And it's a question we're going to keep exploring as we dig deeper into Dominion.
It really does make you think. And one thing that Holland focuses on is how the ideas within Christianity itself changed over time.
Okay, so we talked about the ancient world, but how did those Christian ideas shape things later on? Like, where do we see this influence in a more concrete way?
Well, one really striking example Holland gives is the execution of Artapaktis. He was a Persian governor during the Greco-Persian Wars, captured by the Athenians, and let's just say he didn't have a happy ending.
We're talking before Christianity.
Yeah, centuries before, Artapaktis was pinned to a board, alive, and left to die. It was brutal, but pretty normal back then. What Holland points out is that this kind of cruelty, even though it was accepted in the ancient world, it became less and less thinkable as Christian values spread. The idea that even your enemies deserve some level of humane treatment, that suffering should be minimized. Holland traces those ideas back to the Christian Revolution.
So it's not just that Christians acted differently themselves, but their values, their ideas about human dignity started to influence society as a whole.
That's the argument. It's subtle, but it's a huge change. And it leads to another fascinating point: the impact of Christianity on the very idea of belief.
We talked about that earlier, how Christianity made belief so central to who you are. But how did that actually play out? How did it challenge the powers that be at the time?
Okay, think about the Roman Empire. Emperor worship was like a given in Roman society.
Right.
But as Christianity spread, you suddenly had people who refused to see the emperor as a god. They believed in one God, and that God wasn't Caesar.
I can see how that would be a direct threat to the state.
It absolutely was. It was a radical act of defiance, and it led to waves of persecution. Christians were seen as dangerous, undermining the whole social order. But the amazing thing is they didn't back down. They clung to their beliefs even when they were imprisoned, tortured, even killed.
You have to admire their courage. It's hard to imagine today holding on to something that strongly knowing it could cost you your life.
It speaks to the power of belief. And Holland argues that it was this unshakable faith that ultimately led to Christianity's success. The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church.
Right, their willingness to die for what they believed in was such a powerful statement. It reminds us that ideas have power, and that even against incredible force, faith can be a powerful weapon.
Yeah, it really is. And this brings us to another turning point in Holland's story: Constantine, the Roman emperor, converting to Christianity in the 4th century.
A big moment, right? Christianity went from being persecuted to being the official religion of the Roman Empire.
A seismic shift. And Holland shows us how this combining of religion and power had long-lasting effects. You see it in the way the church became so connected to the state and the rise of Christendom as this dominant force in Europe.
But it wasn't all smooth sailing, even within Christianity itself, right?
Yeah.
There were divisions, arguments, different interpretations of the faith.
Oh, absolutely. Holland doesn't shy away from the conflicts within the church. He talks about the rise of heresies, the debates over doctrine, the clashes between different groups.
Like the Donatists in North Africa. They thought the church should be this perfect community of saints, totally pure and uncompromising, and they rejected anyone who they thought had betrayed the faith during times of persecution.
Exactly. They represent this purist side of Christianity, one that often clashed with those who wanted a more inclusive, a more practical approach.
And then there was the whole debate about the nature of Christ, which led to the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. Bishops from all over the empire trying to come up with one unified doctrine.
It was a key moment, and it shows us another interesting thing about Christianity, its ability to change and adapt.
How so?
Well, the Council of Nicaea wasn't just about settling arguments. It was about shaping what Christianity itself was. It was about defining what it meant to be a Christian in a world that was changing rapidly.
So they were creating a framework for belief, a
Yeah.
kind of theological roadmap for the future.
Precisely. And that process is still happening today. As Christianity spread, it encountered new cultures, new challenges, and it had to change to survive.
It's like this ongoing conversation, a dialogue between faith and the world constantly shifting and reshaping itself.
That's a great way to put it. And you can see this especially in how Christianity shaped the medieval world.
So we're talking about the time after the Roman Empire fell.
Yeah, and it's during this time that you see how Christianity, having taken so much from the classical world, became the main cultural force in Europe. It influenced art, literature, law, politics, everything.
So it wasn't just about forcing people to believe certain things. It was about creating a whole way of life.
Exactly. Holland talks about the rise of monasteries, the development of a uniquely Christian way of seeing the world, the way the church became the central institution in society, providing education, charity, even political leadership.
And this is when we see figures who become like the icons of Christian piety. Saints like Benedict of Nursia, whose rules for monastic life shapes how Western monasticism developed.
They really embodied those ideals.
Yeah.
Humility, compassion, service to others, and their stories helped shape the spiritual landscape of Europe.
And it wasn't just about individual piety either. There was this growing sense of Christendom, of a united Christian society, a kind of spiritual empire across Europe.
Absolutely. And that sense of Christendom was strengthened by things like pilgrimages to holy sites, the Crusades, even having a shared church calendar.
It's incredible how all these different elements came together to create a shared identity, a sense of belonging that went beyond national borders.
Yeah, but we can't forget that this idea of Christendom wasn't always a good thing.
Right? We can't ignore the darker side. The persecution of heretics, the Crusades, the Inquisition, those are all part of the story too.
Holland acknowledges those dark parts. He reminds us that the history of Christianity is complicated, a mix of good and bad.
And that story is still unfolding even today.
Exactly. As we move into the later parts of Dominion, we see how the Christian Revolution, with all its triumphs and tragedies, is still shaping our world in ways we might not even realize.
So even in a secular age, are we still living in the shadow of the cross?
That's the question Holland wants us to think about.
Yeah, it's a question that really stays with you. And Holland dives into how those ideas within Christianity itself evolved over time.
He says that to understand how Christianity affected the world, you have to understand those moments when things shifted inside the faith itself, those moments of breaking apart and reforming.
Okay, I'm with you so far. What are some examples of those internal shifts? Like what moments really stand out?
The Reformation is a big one. It wasn't just about people being unhappy with corruption in the church. It was a fundamental change in how people understood their relationship with God. You know, Martin Luther nailing his 95 Theses to the church door, challenging the whole structure of the Catholic Church.
That was a pretty radical thing to do.
Mhm.
And it led to Protestantism, a whole new branch of Christianity.
Right. And a key part of that shift was moving away from seeing the church as the only way to reach God. Protestants put more emphasis on a personal relationship with God, one based on your own conscience and studying the Bible directly.
So they were kind of democratizing faith, giving more power to the individual.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And this idea of individual conscience had a huge impact. It led to new ways of thinking about freedom, the role of government, even the idea of a society based on agreement rather than force.
I see where you're going with this.
Mm-hmm.
So those theological debates within Christianity ended up affecting things way beyond religion itself.
Exactly. And that brings us back to Holland's main argument. that those ideas we see as secular, those values we connect with the Enlightenment or other historical movements, they're actually deeply rooted in Christian thinking.
I'm still struggling a bit with that. How can something like the separation of church and state, which is like the foundation of secular democracy,
Yeah.
be rooted in Christianity?
Well, Holland isn't saying that those ideas were clearly laid out by the early church. He's making a more subtle point. He's saying that these ideas grew within a culture and a way of thinking that were already shaped by Christian assumptions. Assumptions about human nature, the relationship between people and authority, even the whole purpose of society.
So even when they're not specifically religious, these Christian ideas are still there in the background, influencing how we see the world.
That's the idea. And it goes beyond politics, too. Holland even connects the origins of modern science to a Christian view of the world.
But we talked about how the scientific revolution challenged religion.
It did in many ways. But Holland says that it also came out of a particularly Christian understanding of the universe. The idea that the universe is ordered, it has laws, it was created by a God who is rational. Those ideas, he argues, were fostered within a Christian way of thinking.
So it's more complicated than just saying science replaced religion. It's more like they both influenced each other.
Exactly. And it's that kind of nuance, that refusal to oversimplify history, that makes Dominion so interesting. Holland is always pushing us to question our assumptions, to see the connections, the messy parts that we might otherwise overlook.
It's definitely been an eye-opening conversation so far, but let's be honest, not everything about Christianity's legacy is something to be proud of. Holland doesn't shy away from the darker parts of the story, does he?
Definitely not. He talks about the Crusades, the Inquisition, the persecution of heretics, and anyone who was considered different. He grapples with how Christian beliefs were used to justify violence, oppression, and intolerance.
It really makes you question the whole idea of progress, doesn't it?
It does. And Holland doesn't give us easy answers. He just shows us the evidence and makes us confront those uncomfortable truths, the moral gray areas that are part of history.
So where does that leave us now in the 21st century? If Holland is right, are we all still living in the shadow of the cross, even if we don't know it?
That's the question Holland wants us to wrestle with. He says we can't really understand ourselves, our values, our world, without understanding how deeply Christianity has influenced us. It's a legacy that's still shaping us, whether we consider ourselves religious or not, even if we completely reject its teachings.
It's like we're all part of this story that's still being written. And maybe by understanding that story with all its twists and turns, we can better deal with the challenges we face today.
Maybe. It definitely gives us a new perspective on the world, a new understanding of how powerful ideas can be. It reminds us that history isn't just something that happened in the past. It's alive within us, shaping who we are and what we become.
It's been an amazing deep dive. We've really only scratched the surface of this book. It's so rich and thought-provoking.
There's so much more to unpack. We could talk about this for hours.
We hope this has made you want to explore these ideas more on your own. If you're intrigued by what we've talked about today, we encourage you to check out Dominion. See what you think of Holland's argument. It's a fascinating and often surprising look at how Christianity changed the world.
And hey, if you want to keep having these kinds of conversations, make sure to subscribe to The Deep Dive. We've got more deep dives coming up on all sorts of interesting topics.
We love exploring these big questions, the ones that make you think about everything in a new way.
And we love hearing from you. Share this episode with your friends, your family, anyone who likes a good intellectual workout.
Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive. We'll see you next time.
Keep exploring, keep questioning, keep diving deep.